We're doing this program to kind of give an understanding of the overview of Black History Month. We know that we're at the tail end of Black History Month here, and this is an opportunity for us to look back at Black excellence and the Black legacy and the legacy that has really built this nation and how that pertains to us as Muslims and the significance of that for us as Muslims. The first two speakers that we have, the reason that we invited them, they've joined us from South Dallas. They're from a masjid called Masjid Al-Quran. It's in South Dallas in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. And the reason why we brought these brothers is because we want them to address mass incarceration and the school to prison pipeline. For those who don't know, inshallah, tonight we'll be educated on that. And what makes these brothers qualified is because not just that they've studied it and they understand it, it's because they are intimately connected with this concept. Their communities are still suffering from the calamities of mass incarceration and the school to prison pipeline, and they are in South Dallas living in the communities which are afflicted by it, and they have dedicated their lives to combating this issue. And the really important thing that we must understand and recognize is that although they work with a number of groups, they've made it a point to make the masjid the platform by which they combat this. So our first speaker is Imam Shariff. Imam Shariff is the current Imam of Masjid Al-Quran. He is very, very knowledgeable on mass incarceration. He knows this topic inside and out. And he will be sharing with us some information about this. And also they're going to be focusing on not just the reality and the history and everything, but what is it that we can do as Muslims living here in Dallas? What is it that we can do to help in this? So with that, I'll hand it over to Imam Shariff.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. By the glorious one enlightened, by the night when it is still, thy guardian Lord is not forsaken thee, nor is he displeased. Verily the hereafter will be better for thee than the present, and soon thy guardian Lord will give thee that therewith thou shalt be well pleased. They did not find you an orphan and give thee shelter and care, and he found thee wandering and gave thee guidance, and found thee in need and made thee independent. Therefore treat not the orphan with harshness, nor repulse the petitioner unheard, but the bounty of thy Lord rehearse and proclaim. Ameen. As the brother mentioned, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah. As the brother mentioned, this being Black History Month, and we do want to address the month within itself, but we also want you to understand that Black History Month is something that's recognized, but it's also something lived by a group of people each and every day. We want to begin speaking in the sense of where and how mass incarceration came to be. It's not something that everybody is really sure what purpose it served, but it did serve a purpose because years back, let's say after the end of slavery, we have to be mindful that the mass incarceration began as far back as that. Trying to figure out how to re-enslave a group of people that had been enslaved and captured and stripped of their culture. These people were now to be free, okay, and to control that was the objective. So one of the first laws that were passed after the free and the emancipation, one of the first laws was passed was the vagrancy law. And understanding the vagrancy law from the platform that if you were not on a plantation and you were free, but you yet had nowhere to live, you fell up under the vagrancy law. Hence, the 13th Amendment could be applied, which would allow you to be incarcerated. Moving forward, each time the establishment assaulted the community of the African, it was based in a socioeconomic perspective and the growth of the country. From 1865 to 1900, 1910, the African community was prepared to trade internationally, but that community was destroyed. People was burned, hanged, until the mindset of those that were left were in fear. But those who had the mindset to move forward and progress, they were hanged and destroyed. Hence, we move forward another 40 years and 50 years, and that energy within the African community arose again, brings us to the 1960s, 1970s, when we were very much in a community mindset. You had the birth of the Nation of Islam, which built the foundation of the Islam that you practice today. This is something that we should pay homage to, because without those works and those efforts of the nation, we might not be as easily free to practice our religion as we do today. With that in mind, the same thing happened to the nation that happened within the African community. Desegregation, civil rights. What we gained with civil rights, we lost. Our sense of community that we did have, we gave it up to assimilate another community. That in turn hurt the African community. But as I sit here and I look at this beautiful sight of how the family is orientated here in your community, you have a community of Muslims that have been separated from one another. And they don't have the opportunity to quite practice as you guys practice here today, because they've lost their sense of community as a people. Right? You guys here can be together, you can pray together, you can go to school together. Okay, well, the African community does not do that, and the African American Muslim community struggles within those communities. Yet we are fixed in changing the environment and the things that have happened to us in the past. We move forward again. After the civil rights and the dismantling of many organizations that were geared toward the benefiting of our communities, once they were dismantled by the establishment, we move forward into the 80s, when the community again is at risk. And what happened? In order for you to have mass incarceration within the state of Texas, say in 84 to 85, the state of Texas had 42 penitentiaries. 6 years later, they had approximately 152 penitentiaries, and the African community made up 78% of the population. How did that happen? The establishment had a scheme they put in place where they dumped masses of cocaine into the community. They also went along with the deindustrialization of the community and the outsourcing at that time. When we ceased to manufacture as many products as we did in the past in the birth of the nation. So you take your middle class out, in a sense, within the African community. The reason why I'm discussing these things is because I would like you to get a clear window of understanding of the community that is around Masjid al-Quran and our purpose, understanding our purpose to bring a sense of community, to end mass incarceration, and to end the school and prison pipeline. And as I said, 6 years later, they had 152 penitentiaries. So you have to think, how did they fill those penitentiaries up? Well, in the 80s, they filled those penitentiaries up by the cocaine era and the crack cocaine era. No pass, no play. A lot of things were implemented that hindered the African American from his growth. Desegregation being one in a great sense. Why? Because the child had to get through certain hurdles, and it affected them. And hence, by affecting them, it changed their character. So once you grab that generation of kids that's between 19 and 25 in the 80s, you fill your penitentiaries up. What do you have to do next? You have to keep them sustained. Hence, the brother will speak of the pipeline that was created. The most important thing we're trying to move forward in within our community is to change the social economic environment, to change the educational results. The African community does not get the same results out of the educational system as other communities. So you have to ask yourself why. We have asked ourselves why. We have educated ourselves in that fashion. I myself have 4 degrees, one, a master's being in public administration to understand the social, political dynamic that policies are written under. I have a universal studies degree, which is a bachelor's that focuses on criminal justice, humanities, and sociology. And I also have a business degree and an electronics degree. These are the things that we have equipped ourselves with. The brothers in education, and he'll explain his background. We spent years equipping ourselves with this information in order to make a difference within our community. We get the same things out of same politicians. Doesn't make a difference what side of the table they're on, whether they're Democrat or Republican. We have to ask ourselves why. My concern is that regardless of who fills the seat, there are responsibilities that go with that seat. So it really doesn't make a difference who wins the seat, the Republican or the Democrat in the African community. What makes a difference to us is whether or not they fulfill their responsibilities to the community. These are amongst the things that we have set out as we begin creating programs for our youth, programs for our young men that are fathers, and programs that are for our young women. The growth of our community is essential. If not, we see ourselves falling further and further behind. We're looking for the Muslim community to support our efforts in a fashion that is solely supported by Quran, in the sense that when you see a wrong or an injustice, you are to change it with your hands. And if that does not change it, then you speak out against it. And if that does not change it, then you detest it in your heart. The latter being the weakest form of faith. We have equipped ourselves to change it with our hands. We have moved into the community. I live in one of the worst communities in that blue area that you mentioned at the last meeting, in one of the most high-risk areas. But at the same time, I'm very much at home because I understand that the natural resources that have been removed from the community are the individuals themselves, meaning our A students, our best and our brightest. They're just like any other natural resource. If you continue to pull it out of the ground, there's no way a community can grow. We are in the mindset of reestablishing our communities to where when we have family nights within the community that everybody comes out, they have their children. We're talking about doing work within the community that's going to build Muslims from the outside in. Because most of the people that are in the African community within DFW are, if not first generation Nation of Islam or second generation Nation of Islam. The only way Islam is really going to grow is if we move out into the community, which we have done. Islam is supposed to make a difference. And we are looking for support from the Islamic community to do so. And that's why we're here tonight. You know I breezed through Black history. But I also don't look forward to being marginalized in the sense of we recognize Black history once a year, but yet we live up under the conditions and the socioeconomic oppression day in and day out. So as the brother goes into the prison pipeline, we just want you guys to consider the things that you can practice if you move outside of your comfort zone. Islam should spread. Right now, And I don't actually think it has the best outlook nationwide, but it can. And it's about the work that's put in. With that, I'll leave you as I came. Assalamu alaikum. And I'll pass it to Brother Jamil.
Jazakallah khair, Imam Sharif. As he mentioned, Brother Jamil is going to be talking about the school to prison pipeline. I wanted to mention one thing based on what he was saying, that he needs support from the community. I wanted to recognize that, last week there was a group of young Muslims, an organization YM. They were trying to do a program for Black History Month. And we considered whether to invite these brothers to one of the masajid where they have their halaqah. But I want to commend those brothers that they made this decision, that instead of inviting them to come, they all decided to go down to South Dallas to Masjid al-Quran, 100 deep, right? And 100 guys were sitting in the hall. And we listened to both of these brothers. We listened to the sisters who have been in that community for a very long time. And we really got the ability to understand that community and the plight that that community is going through. And one thing that I want to mention is that I don't think we've ever felt more welcome at a masjid. That they were so happy that we were coming, and it was almost like, why hadn't we done this before? And so that's something that I would hope that we can do, is that we can begin to, all of us, a reminder to myself and everyone else, we can begin to go to these communities where the masajid were there, where the Muslims were there, before there was such a large population of Muslims in this country. We have to remember those brothers and sisters and the struggles that they had. Brother Jamil is a community organizer and educator in South Dallas also. These two brothers, they do this excellent program that myself and another brother also had the pleasure of attending, where you listen to all the degrees and the qualifications that the brother has. But every weekend, these brothers have a meeting with about 20 youth, and not Muslim youth, just general youth from the community, who at the ages of 15, 16, 17 years old are already going through the process of criminalization, and they already have started developing a record. And many of these youth are on probation, and they have things around their ankles, and they have court sentences. And these brothers take the time out to counsel them and to talk to them and try to assist them in avoiding, what could be calamity. And so Brother Jamil will be talking about the school to prison pipeline, inshallah.
To my brothers, I want to greet you with Assalamu alaikum. My sisters, Assalamu alaikum. As he said, my name is Brother Jamil. I am an educator by trade. I've been teaching since 1999. I got into education for the sole purpose of being able to serve the children in my community. With that in mind, I am a child of poverty. And I want you to understand what that means so that I can kind of add a little perspective. Inshallah, I'll be able to paint a picture for you so that you can truly understand the work that we do and how critical and crucial this work is for our community. If you take a child, say this child's age, and you put them in a condition, and when I say poverty, I mean you're talking about an environment where it is lacking, right? And so what are we talking about lacking? We're lacking family support. So if you pull the fathers away, you pull oftentimes the mothers away. As he mentioned, drugs hit our community very hard, and a lot of our parents got addicted to the drugs that were poured in. There's history, there's documentaries that you can actually watch that shows how the U.S. government was actually bringing in cocaine from South America to fund a war and pumping the drugs directly into the black community as another way of derailing our people. So if you take that story back and we go to the beginning of this blip of history for our people, and I want to make that known that this is just a blip of history. Today, my intention is to get you to understand that we are a people of great legacy. We are people who are not a degraded people naturally. We're not a people who are naturally imbalanced or naturally impoverished. We come from a rich history. When the Europeans and the Arabs and even the Africans decided that they were going to start the transatlantic slave trade, they specifically stole people, specific people, based on specific gifts, talents, things that creative, culturally, they stole a particular people. Many of us were Muslims when we were stolen. But when we crossed that boat, that river, that ocean on that boat, and we came over here to the banks of America, all of that was stripped away. Okay, and we were put into the worst conditions. Those of us who did make it across the ocean, many of us died on the boat ride over. All right, so I want you to understand that we are people who have been traumatized, but we did not come from that. We are ancient people, right? We are people of origin. We're people who are foundational, right? And so this little blip in history that we're telling you about is a story of a people trying to restore themselves back to their prior legacies, back to their prior existence before this thing called America, this social and political and economic experiment called America, right, took us away from who we truly were. All right, so if you take that history and you say that we spent up until 1865 in captivity. So we're working on plantations, essentially building this nation. And mind you, not all of us were on plantation. There were indigenous Africans who were already in the Americas at that time, right? Who, many of them, by virtue of being black, could have been subject to becoming enslaved. But there were some who were never slaves, right? But once the social construct of black became a thing, then it included all people who were of dark skin, right? And so then the system was able to racially discriminate against a specific people based on the color of their skin. Then the caste and class system was created. And as the brother said, after emancipation took place and we were so-called freed from bondage, physical bondage, the process of creating laws and codes for freemen began to take place. And that's when you get, as he said, your vagrancy laws, your black codes, and different social barriers that begin to set up more and more boundaries for our people to receive our own liberation, our own freedom. When left alone, one thing that these people began to realize is that when we're left alone, we will begin to build. And we did that many times. Off the plantation, within a matter of 50 years, we had built historically black colleges and universities. Even before the emancipation, there were 2 or 3 black colleges that existed in the North. Okay, so these were people who were coming together and saying education was important. On the plantation, it was illegal for us to learn how to read or write. So as an educator, I'm thinking, why would they want to keep a people from learning how to read or write? Right? It must be something to that. But our people never stopped fighting to learn to read and write. So as I said, after slavery ended, we began to build black colleges. Over 121 black colleges were built. And so we move fast forward and we're constantly trying to establish ourselves, and then you move into the 1960s and you're talking about a civil rights package. And I know I'm speeding through, but I want to kind of set some kind of historical presence so you can understand how we got to where we are now. And you move, and many of you know about Dr. King and the civil rights movement and the civil rights package that supposedly gave us these rights. The desegregation for many of us wasn't the golden nugget. It wasn't successful for us, all right? Because if you think about it, if there's a force that doesn't want you to be a part of their system, and then they're forced by the government to put you into their system, how do you think they're going to treat you? Do you think you're going to get the best education? I mean, just think about it, really. I mean, do you really think that you'll get the education that's best for the success of your people when you have been forced integrated into their system? Well, what happened is, once these desegregation laws came through and the government forced us to be integrated in, the system began to devise ways to essentially use the system against us. Right? And so we talk about going to the school. The brother has a story. I'm kind of wondering why he didn't share it, but he always talks about what desegregation did. He's a little older than I am, and so he's first generation desegregation. And then being placed into a system in the South where your teachers look at you like you're less than, you're inferior. You might have dreams of becoming a doctor, a lawyer, whatever, and they're going to, no, you can't do that. Your people don't do that. Right? So you have to think about what we integrated into. Laws were passed civically to essentially create a system in which how can we create a way to send them back to the plantations? How can we use the public school system to send them back to the plantations? Right? There's a clause in the 13th Amendment that was supposed to free us that said unless, right, you're free unless you commit a crime. So what do? They create environments in which criminality is your only economic source, right? We have a system of where we have these ghettos or these urban areas. Even though it's integrated, we have an urban area, and essentially it's an area that's concentrated with poor black people. And they create economic embargoes around it. There are food deserts. Not only are there food deserts, they circle around it and they redline the areas and they don't loan money to people in the area. So business is not a part of that environment. The economics is stifled, the food is stifled, the education is stifled, right? And this has happened, I'm not even in the past anymore. I'm telling you, this is a legacy that they have created for our people that currently exists. And where we sit at in South Dallas, where Masjid al-Quran is, it is a prime example of a community that has been economically deprived. You cannot buy good food in that area. People buy food from the grocery store, from the corner store instead of a grocery store. So you go to the gas station and get your food, okay? And we all know how important food is. The schools, I spent a day at a school up the street from the Masjid. Our children are suffering even in the schools. The schools are built primarily in the same structure that the prisons are. Some of them don't even have windows on them. I mean, if there is windows, they're painted so you can't even get light from the outside on it. All right? So we're fighting an uphill battle. We went to a program yesterday, or the day before yesterday, and it talked about a rigged system. We talk about how they politically disenfranchise us, how they economically disenfranchise us, how there's voter suppression tactics that they use, gerrymandering where they mark the districts up in a certain way where they can essentially minimize the black vote so that the economic dollars don't come through to support any kind of economic growth in the communities. All right, and so a part of our work at Masjid al-Quran is looking at all of these injustices, looking at all of these abuses, all of these human right violations, and figuring out ways that we can support our youth who are most vulnerable to these kinds of oppressions. Because we feel like if we can do something with the youth in the way of education and creating programming and creating awareness, that we can create a movement that allows them to be the catalyst of change. When we spoke to the 70, 80, 90 brothers that came to the Masjid last week, I tried to implore them to be a part of the change. We have a huge census. Census 2020, I see the brothers and sisters over here are fully engaged in the Census 2020 for Plano. We need that in Dallas. But we don't have the awareness that you all have out here. People don't really realize how important it is that you are counted. Not only that, a lot of people have criminal backgrounds that they're afraid to even engage with anything that's dealing with the government. So there's a whole educational mindset that we have to, kind of change around. But we need support from brothers and sisters like you. We need support for the programs that we have. Our people are lacking in education. Our people are lacking in health care. Mental health is if you can imagine all of the trauma that that little brief, spotty history that I just gave you is way more detailed, but that brief, spotty history, all you see is trauma. trauma. So we're talking about a people who have been traumatized and the wounds don't even get to heal. So we need support in mental health and physical health. We need food support. We need a lot of support for our community. And so when we are allowed the opportunities to come and share these stories and try to, touch your heart in the way of compassion where you feel enough empathy and love for those who are 40 minutes outside of where you live, who are not as fortunate and blessed as you all are, we come with the message of peace. Let's build a bridge. Let's build a way that we can work together to do the work that we have to do, because we can't do it alone. We need the support of all of you brothers and sisters. So inshallah, we can have a discussion. We can gain more understanding. I'm honored and grateful to have this opportunity to speak to you, because this is my work. This is what we do nonstop. And so I'll close as I began. Assalamu alaikum, assalamu alaikum.
I just wanted to, as we prepare to listen to Shaykh Yasir, who's going to be talking about the topic that was on the flyer, African American Muslims, pioneers of Islam in America. The reason that we brought these two brothers here, I know Brother Jamil mentioned that he's honored to be here, but I'm sure the entire community is honored to have these brothers here also. I think that we should really grab every opportunity that we have to, try to bring the communities together. As I mentioned, the work that they're doing, they really need the support of the entire community. And so as these brothers are here, I would recommend and really invite everyone that when the program is over, they're going to be here. We should all really greet them and find out what they need from us, because one thing that I'll mention, working with them, extremely welcoming and very easy to work with, very transparent people, and they're excellent people to work with, and we ask that Allah accepts all their efforts. Ameen. And with that, we'll hand it over to Shaykh Yasir.
Jazakallah khair. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala ma ba'd. First and foremost, jazakumullah to our two distinguished guests. We really appreciate your presence here. And this masjid is your masjid. And I apologize for not having visited your masjid. Inshallah, we're going to exchange numbers. And whenever you're willing to invite me, inshallah, I'll be there, inshallah ta'ala, try my best to expedite that, inshallah. And these types of programs need to be more often. We need to definitely exchange our talent, and each community should know what the other communities are doing. Before I briefly summarize my own points, may I strongly suggest all of you here watch a documentary called The 13th. Okay, it is an award-winning documentary. It's on Netflix, and it's eye-opening. And I thought I knew all of this stuff. When I watched the documentary, I was in tears almost and wanting to scream out of anger and frustration. I mean, it's just the way the system is rigged. It's so depressing, and you just feel so much exasperation, and most of us in this audience, we have no clue how the system has been rigged against certain minorities, and especially our African American brothers and sisters. So please watch The 13th. It's on the standard, it's Netflix and all that. I'm not going to give a long talk. It's going to be a very brief overview, because I strongly feel that most of us in this audience, really, we haven't done justice to the history of Islam before the arrival of our fathers and our, one generation before us. We think that Islam came with us, and that's simply not true. Islam has been in this land for over 350 years. In fact, there are references to even more than this. Christopher Columbus's discovery as well is linked a little bit to the fall of the caliphate in Granada, as I have mentioned a number of times. However, the largest wave of Muslims that first came to this land, before that were very small. We count them on the fingers of one hand. A few people here and there that migrated and realized the reason why Muslims didn't come like the Irish did, like the Italians did, was that America was a tough land to live in. America was the unexplored frontier. In the 1800s, it was a very difficult land. The only reason you'd come here is if your own situation was very, very dire. And by and large, Muslim lands were at peace. Muslim lands were flourishing. Why would you give that up and go to a faraway, strange land? The earliest people that came to this land willingly were either people who fled religious persecution, like the Pilgrims and their ilk, or those that suffered extreme economic hardship, like the Irish and the great, potato famine drought of the 1850s and whatnot. Those were the two main groups that came willingly. The largest group that came unwillingly are, of course, the slaves that came from Africa. And amongst them, around 15 to 20% were Muslims. Around 15 to 20% of all of those hundreds of thousands of people that came, they were of our faith and our background. Of course, all of this was injustice, but no doubt we feel an even greater sense when it is somebody that is of our own Islamic heritage and background, even though, of course, the crime is universal. And all of you should be aware that we have documented evidence of the existence of Muslim slaves doing what they could to practice their faith. How do we know this? Multiple accounts. First and foremost, the diaries of the slave owners. Slave owners are writing down what they're witnessing in their slaves. And we have plenty of such diaries still around that explicitly mention very clear Islamic practices. One of them mentions that I came to know of a religion called Islam or Mohammedanism, he called it, because my slave would regularly pray 5 times a day facing the north. He would fall down on his head. This is a white slave order in the 1820s. And he's mentioning that one of his slaves is regularly praying, facing, the north and bowing down. We have another slave owner in the Sapelo Islands of Georgia mentioning that he preferred to buy Mohammedan slaves. They called Islam back then Mohammedanism. He preferred to buy Mohammedan slaves because they didn't get drunk. So he preferred to get those slaves because the other ones would get drunk. So at least he would purchase Muslim slaves so that they didn't get drunk. And because of that, there was actually a community of slaves on Sapelo Islands in the 1820s and 30s. We have documented evidence they actually built an open-air masjid in that island. And they would celebrate Eid. The owners would mention this in the diary, that they passed out a certain cake that is still cooked to this day in West Africa on the day of Eid. They would bake that cake and they would hand it out, like a type of basbousa or something. They would actually make it on that day. This is 250 years ago, and they're celebrating Eid on this land over here. That's the first evidence. We have many dozens of eyewitness accounts of slave owners who saw what their slaves were doing and recorded it. And then, even more significant, we have the writings of many of those Muslim slaves as well. The actual writings that they have are preserved. Much of them are still preserved in the Smithsonian. I myself have seen a good selection in the Smithsonian. You can go there. There's a special exhibit. It's free of charge, by the way. Smithsonian Museums, entire DC, it's our tax money. We should take advantage of so many museums that are really nice museums. And there's a museum that is, when I went, there was actually an exhibit of Muslim slaves. I think that was a temporary exhibit. I don't think it's permanent. But they have a slave museum, and they have within it, they have a number of Qur'ans that were handwritten by the slaves. This is American Islamic history, over 200 years old. Manuscripts of the Quran that were written by slaves. And I've seen this with my own eyes, and you can Google them and find images if you're not going to go to DC. And the irony, of course, is one of the funny stories is that the slave, one of the slaves, his owner wanted to convert to Christianity. So he was impressed that the slave could write Arabic. So he said to the slave, I want you to write the first chapter of the Bible. They call it the Lord's Prayer, let's say. I want you to write the Lord's Prayer in Arabic. So the slave wrote Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman, the whole Surah Fatiha. And then at the end he goes, and my slave master thinks this is the Lord's Prayer, but this is Surah Al-Fatiha. He writes it in Arabic, right? So the point is that, and we have that, by the way, we have an image still. If you want to Google that, there's an actual image of that still to this day. And the slave owner, who is proudly saying, my slave is now a Christian, he's written the Lord's Prayer, and lo and behold, of course, once you are a Muslim, you're never going to, convert away. But sometimes you have to just say, they're being tortured, persecuted, whatever. They had to do whatever they had to do. So subhanAllah, slavery did bring a large group of Muslims over here. However, obviously, these slaves by and large were forced to convert to Christianity. They were not able to maintain their identity for multiple generations. Along with this, around the 1870s or so, small groups of Muslims began to migrate from Muslim lands. These were not more than at max 25,000 in the entire 20-30 years. At max 25,000 Muslims came, and those Muslims came because there was a a famine taking place in the province of Syria in the Ottoman Empire, and so they did come for economic opportunities beginning around 1870 or so. However, they kind of sort of remained to themselves. They settled in Idaho, in upper state New York, in sections of Canada, and still we have remnants of their families. Frankly, most of the descendants of those original Muslims are no longer Muslims, and I've met a number of them. By and large, they have left Islam. They weren't able to preserve their Islam either. So the next phase, very quickly, that is of great interest to us, it begins around the 1910s, to be more precise, 1913, when what is called the pseudo-Islamic movements began. Now, us Muslims of the quote-unquote Orthodox background were very dismissive of these movements. However, I argue that we need to rethink through the purpose of those movements. We should not judge those movements merely on the basis of theology. We should judge those movements also on the basis of the impact that they caused. This is not to justify their bizarre theology. This is not to excuse. However, it is to say that we weigh the pros and cons, and we also look at the pros even as we criticize some of the cons that took place back then. Around 1900, 1920, or between this era, there was an outburst of religiosity. There was a revivalist movement amongst African Americans, and this is displayed in a number of churches that were also born in this time frame, where African Americans, they discovered a type of Christianity that is still around to this day. It's a different type that is found in mainstream Protestant churches, and they're bringing in their culture, their heritage. Along with this, in this same time frame, for the very first time, movements also erupted that were not Christian, and some of them were Pan-Africanists. Some of them brought in some issues from, the religions of Jamaica and others, and some of them, a very small handful, they brought in pseudo-Islamic elements. Perhaps the most famous is called, or was called, the Moorish Science Temple. The Moorish Science Temple. Now, back then, Muslims were called Moors. That's what they were called. From Morocco, Moors. Because Morocco was the main country that was closest to, by the way, Morocco was the first country to recognize America. 1776, the first country to recognize America as an independent nation was Morocco. And Morocco and America actually had ties together, trade treaties, because again, Morocco and America are the closest from after the Atlantic. So there's a number of trade treaties that they had. And the Moorish Science Temple, you can call it, Moorish means the Arabesque or the African Arabesque or the Moroccan. So the Moorish Science Temple was begun by Noble Drew Ali. Noble Drew Ali. And again, the name Ali is obviously a Muslim name. Now, he did have something called the Quran, the Holy Quran, and we have copies of this. You can find them on Amazon or whatnot. This has nothing to do with our Quran. He called it the Holy Quran, but it is a book of his own writing and whatnot. It has nothing to do with our Quran. They began to dress like Moroccans with the fez cap. They began to dress like Moroccans. They adopted pseudo-Moroccan or African names like El Shabazz became very common. The name Shahbaz became very common amongst them, others as well. They also are the ones who began the X at the end of their names, right? The Malcolm X is going to come later on. The Moorish Science Temple was the first one to begin this notion of X. Nonetheless, their theology is not recognizable to us as Islam. They don't have salah, they don't have zakah, but they have elements of Islamic culture. The dress, the garb, the Quran, Mecca, these are there, but in actual theology. So Noble Drew Ali, it is very clear that he never really studied Islam. He had really no idea other than what he's reading, but he's trying his best to bring something for his people that is different than the status quo. And by the way, the Moorish Science Temple at its height, at its pinnacle, probably had around 30,000, 40,000 people, and this is in New Jersey and New York area primarily, but they were also in Detroit and Chicago. These days, the Moorish Science Temple is essentially non-existent. They still have one temple left in New Jersey, and from what I know, there's around 100 people. All of these, pretty much all of them, are 70, 80 years old. They're the descendants of the first batch. That really is just a very small group that is still clinging on. They are obviously not active anymore, and you might meet one or two, but really they are no longer a viable movement like they once were. They fizzled out. This movement fizzled out. The second movement that came was the most successful pseudo-Islamic movement, and we owe a lot to it, even us here in this room. We owe a lot to what they have done and the foundations that they have laid. And of course, that movement is the so-called lost and found nation of Islam, the lost and found nation of Islam. And this has a very, very interesting story, which again, time is limited. I'm going to summarize in a few minutes. And one of the biggest mystery factors is we don't know much about the founder of the movement. The founder of the movement is known as Fard Muhammad. And Fard Muhammad is an obscure person. People have tried to research who he was. We have a picture of him. You can find it online. We actually have two pictures, a mugshot when he was arrested, and the picture that is still hung in the Nation of Islam temples to this day. Fard Muhammad is an enigmatic figure. We don't know much about him. However, one of the most prominent theories is that Fard Muhammad is the son of a Indian Muslim who migrated to New Zealand and a local lady of New Zealand. They call themselves Kiwis. That is a fact. They call themselves Kiwis. So he married a Kiwi, a lady from New Zealand, and he was from India. And this is not a conspiracy theory. I don't believe in conspiracy theories. This is as much as we know. This Indian Muslim was a follower of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. Okay, this Indian Muslim who migrated to New Zealand was a follower of the Ahmadi or the Qadiani movement, the Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And so this son is born, and most likely his name is Warith. And he comes to America in 1918 or 1917, and he calls himself Wali. From Warith, he calls himself Wali Fard, Warith Fard something. So he calls himself, Wali Fard, and then eventually, Fard Muhammad. And this person, whoever he was, first he came as a door-to-door salesman. But it turns out it wasn't lucrative enough. He began preaching his version of Islam, and people began following him. And one of his converts was a person who used to be a gambler drunkard by the name of Elijah Poole, who eventually changed his name to Elijah Muhammad. And Elijah Muhammad embraced this version of Islam in the 1920s, mid-1920s, and he followed Fard Muhammad. Now Elijah Muhammad is born and raised in Atlanta. He's an African American. Fard is, as we said, most likely half Indian or maybe Afghan and half New Zealand. This is the most likely theory. There are other theories as well of where the origins of Fard are, because nobody knows, obviously long gone. And he was eventually expelled because of a visa fraud, or because he was caught embezzling. And so in the late 1920s, he was jailed. That's why we have a mugshot of him. He was jailed for stealing and something, and then he was sent away because of the crime that he had done. Elijah Muhammad visited Fard Muhammad in jail. This is according to what he said. We don't know for sure. Elijah is the one telling us this. And Elijah visits him in jail before he's expelled. And Elijah allegedly says, I know who you are. You are Allah in the flesh. And you have been sent to us, the African American community, to liberate us and save us. And according to Elijah, Fard said, that's right, but if you tell the people, they won't accept that. But I am Allah, that's what he's saying, and you are my disciple Muhammad. And so Elijah Muhammad then he took over whatever that da'wah, whatever that call was, and he began preaching a new version of whatever Fard had been doing, and he's the one who created the so-called lost and found Nation of Islam, which was then called the Nation of Islam, and which is then NOI, the Nation of Islam. And Elijah Muhammad began his calls in the early 30s. Now, this coincided with another trend. And this trend, again, there is no conspiracy. You can look this up. This is very clear. And I don't do conspiracies. I really don't believe them at all. But this is a fact. The son of Mirza Ghulam, that's his name, Bashiruddin, the second Khalifa. You know they have their Khalifas. Right now we have the fourth great-great-great-grandson. So the son of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who became the Khalifa, that Khalifa lasted from 1918 to 1965, like over 50 years he was their Khalifa. He made it a point that we need to preach the Ahmadi or the Qadiani theology across the globe. And he would sponsor people to go and preach and teach their version across the globe. And so he chose somebody by the name of Mufti Muhammad Sadiq. You can look it up, we have photos of him, we have his immigration card. He chose Mufti Muhammad Sadiq to come to New York with the explicit commandment that try to convert especially the African American community. And Mufti Muhammad Sadiq went with that purpose in mind, funded by that movement. We have his immigration paper, you can look this up and whatnot. And he began explicitly preaching to the, and of course not just to them, everybody, but the largest following that he had was amongst the African American community. Why? Because remember, this was a time of great oppression. Well, it still is, but back then it was a different level. And he began preaching, if you join Islam, in Islam everybody's equal, which is true. He took the correct things of Islam and he mainstreamed them. He's like, Islam is the faith tradition that from the beginning has promised equality to all races. From the beginning, doesn't matter what your race is. And of course he's quoting Quran and he's quoting the life of the Prophet, he's quoting Bilal. He started a newspaper called the Muslim Sunrise. We still have copies of this, the Muslim Sunrise. He started a newspaper, the Muslim Sunrise. And in this newspaper, he was giving out for free in the districts of Atlanta and of Chicago and of New Jersey and New York that were predominantly African American. He's telling them, come to my lectures and talks. And this, of course, also coincided with Elijah Muhammad's da'wah. Now we still are trying to figure out, how more of this took place, but there's clearly some connection. And one of the most obvious indications of this, by the way, is the official translation that was and still is used by the NOI to this day, is the translation that was done by the Qadiani Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali's Quran translation, not the boxer Muhammad Ali, there was a guy in Pakistan by the name of Muhammad Ali, or India, that Muhammad Ali translated the Quran and he was a student of Mirza Ghulam. To this day, that translation is the official translation of the NOI. And it has always been its translation from the 1940s. How? Again, we're still doing some research how that causal connection takes place. But the Nation of Islam becomes one of the most successful revivalist religious movements amongst the African American community and the most successful pseudo-Islamic one. Now, once again, us Muslims, we look at their theology and frankly it is bizarre. He's preaching stuff that is clearly coming from his imagination. It's obviously not from the Quran and Sunnah. He's preaching that 70,000 years ago there was an evil scientist by the name of Yaqub, and Yaqub was an evil person. Oh, I forgot to mention. So all of mankind was black gods, basically. They were originally black gods. That's the origin of mankind. They were all black gods. One of the evil gods by the name of Yaqub got angry, got irritated. He decided to create a race of devils to cause havoc, to wreak havoc in the world. That race of devils is, of course, who? The white man. Right? So all white people are devils. And of course we have videos of Malcolm saying this in his 50s, in the back in the 50s before he converted to mainstream Islam. All white people are devils. And they also believe that there's this mothership that's going to come take them from Japan. Some UFO is going to come and save them towards the end of times. They have some beliefs that we have to understand. SubhanAllah, it's so easy for us to be critical 80 years later. This message gave them a sense of dignity and hope. This message rationalized for them, how can these people be so mean to us? How can people be so inhumane? The only logical explanation that appealed to them, they're not human beings. Think about what forced them to accept that bizarre theology. Rather than just come and criticize, and of course we don't agree, of course it's wrong. Think about the circumstances that would cause an otherwise rational and normal person to start believing all white people are the devils. How can they believe this? Because of the hatred, because of the xenophobia, because of the clear bigotry that they've been experiencing since the day they were born till the day they die. The only explanation, these people can't be human. And Elijah Muhammad comes with his theology and it all fits into place according to the world that they are in. Also, again, so easy for us to criticize the theology. Look at the social aspect. You know what the nation did? The nation dignified the people who followed it. The nation required men to do jobs, required men to dress, required men to and women to give up alcohol and drugs and gambling, required men to take care of their wives. Don't just sleep around. No, get married, have families, take care of their wives. The Nation of Islam provided jobs. It was a job creating opportunity. Elijah Muhammad himself personally made sure that there's going to be a number of factories that were opened up. Believe it or not, there were fish factories, there were bean pies as well that were sold, like, bakeries and whatnot. He provided opportunities for his people to live a dignified life, to dress with dignity, to act with dignity, to marry with dignity. His people really and truly felt a sense of belonging, a sense of identity. They felt meaning in their lives, perhaps for the first time. So let's look at that aspect as well. And that is why, dear Muslims who are, alhamdulillah, born and raised in traditional Islam, which we thank Allah for, don't forget that the Nation of Islam paved the way for large groups of people to understand and hear what Islam is, to hear the name Allah, the name Quran, the name Mecca. The Nation of Islam, of course, attracted some very, very, very high-profile converts, and those converts jettisoned the nation to a whole different level. Of course, most prominent amongst them was Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, and that is no doubt the legend of American Islam is Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali has done more for American Muslims just because of his name and just because of the izzah that his name has been given. SubhanAllah, that is enough of an honor that he has done for us. Cassius Clay converted. Who else converted? I mean, many people, of course. Malcolm X converted, and his eloquence, of course, is well known. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar initially also converted to the Nation of Islam. All of these great, and there were many dozens of famous people. At its pinnacle, the nation probably had around 1 million followers in the 1960s. That is a huge number for the 1960s. And another point we need to recognize, the nation universally, even to this day, dear Muslims, generally speaking, has a positive reputation amongst the African American community, not a negative one. Why? Because they're looking beyond theology. They're looking at dignity. They're looking at lifestyle. They're looking at commitment, at dedication, at honor. And the nation does teach and preach this amongst its followers. To this day, by and large, the African American community does have an element of respect, more than just an element of respect. Even if they're not a part of the nation, they recognize the nation has done an immense amount of good. And there's hardly, especially back in the 70s and 80s, an African American family except that an extended relative, a cousin, a distant uncle was a part of the nation. So they've all heard of the Nation of Islam, and through that, they've been exposed to some element of Islam. Of course, you all know that the Nation of Islam eventually fizzled out. That's because most of the people, they left it. And of course, Elijah Muhammad's own lifestyle. And in particular, the great hero, the legend that we all look up to, Malcolm X. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him with Jannah Firdaus, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, that his eloquence and his conversion to mainstream Sunnism and his public breaking away. And, the rumors or the legends are that the NOI are the ones that eventually assassinated him. But again, the documentary just came out. I haven't watched the documentary, but still, Allah knows who. But it seems as if definitely they had a role to play. But by the way, let's not exonerate the FBI, because the FBI and the others, they have their roles to play as well in all of this. But maybe the one who pulled the trigger was the nation, but there are people that are interested in others pulling the trigger. So let's not forget that. And the documentary goes into all of this stuff. The point being that the conversion of these great legends to Sunni Islam, Muhammad Ali converted to Sunni Islam, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Malcolm X, they all converted to Sunnism. And alhamdulillah, this paved the way for large amounts and groups of African Americans to from the nation to eventually embrace Sunnism. And of course, we have to give thanks and thank Allah for the legend who really paved the way for this, and that is Warith Deen Muhammad, the son of Elijah Muhammad. Warith Deen Muhammad, when his father passed away in 1975, in February 22nd, 1975, Elijah Muhammad on his deathbed, Elijah sired more than 25 children, as you know, or you should know. 6 legitimate sons and like 18 illegitimate. And he chose out of all of his sons Warith Deen Muhammad. Now, Warith Deen was named after Fard Muhammad, because Fard, his name was Warith as well. So Warith Deen was named after Fard, the founder, the one who was there. And Warith Deen was secretly a Sunni already. Why? Because of Malcolm X. Malcolm X had already spoken to Warith, explained to him, your father preaches something bizarre. I've been to Al-Azhar, I've been to Mecca. The mainstream Muslim world doesn't believe in any of this stuff. You have to break away, you have to. So Warith Deen was already in his heart. He believed in mainstream Islam. And it was Allah's qadr. Some say, and Allah knows best, Elijah knew this and he actually wanted this. I don't know, Allah knows. But it was Allah's qadr that out of all of the sons, Warith Deen was chosen. And Warith Deen was already sympathetic to mainstream Orthodox Sunnism. And so from 1975 up until 1981, in the span of 5 or 6 years, he made it his goal to dismantle the Nation of Islam and to make his large movement join the mainstream Muslim Ummah, which he successfully did in 1981. The Nation of Islam did not pray 5 times a day. The Nation of Islam did not read the Quran. They read the Bible in English and some sections of the Quran. The Nation of Islam fasted in the month of December, their own version of fast. The Nation of Islam did not go for Hajj. They had a very bizarre theology. They didn't believe in the kalima. Well, they did believe in the kalima. There is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. They would say that. There is no God but Allah, in parentheses, Fard Muhammad. And Muhammad is his messenger, in parentheses, Elijah Muhammad. So they said the kalima, but neither the first nor the second kalima have anything to do with us. The son, Warith Deen Muhammad, in 5 years, he took that massive movement and one step after another, dismantling, taking on the critics, until finally in 1981, he officially disbanded the Nation of Islam and he formed the worldwide community of Al-Islam in America, which is essentially the mainstream African American. All of the temples were converted to masjids, and of course, the year after this, the second lieutenant of Elijah by the name of Louis Farrakhan, he broke away from the son, Warith Deen, and he resurrected the Nation of Islam. And Farrakhan is still alive to this day, and he has a small following. Every year, the annual retreat that they have, the Savior's Day, becomes smaller and smaller. And it is my prediction that with the death of Farrakhan, he's already 87 years old, with the death of Farrakhan, I really cannot see this movement flourishing. It's already a very small movement. But alhamdulillah, what it did was, the bulk of the Nation of Islam eventually converted to mainstream Sunnism through the efforts Allah Azza wa Jal used Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and Warith Deen, especially Warith Deen Muhammad. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant him Jannah for those. I was very, very, very honored the year before he passed away that I shared a stage with Warith Deen Muhammad, actually at the ICNA convention. So I owe ICNA a huge gratitude. When I was fresh out of Medina, alhamdulillah, I was not known at all, but they put me on the same panel with Warith Deen, and it was one of my life's big honors to actually share a stage. And he was very elderly at the time, and I shook his hand and said, Yani, and obviously nobody knew he was going to pass away, but I was very grateful to him at the time, and I was thankful to Allah that I was able to meet that legend, Warith Deen Muhammad. And of course, my point is, dear Muslims, I'm going to finish up here inshallah. My point is that Islam in this country would not be Islam without the contributions of African American Muslims. And us, most of us in this audience, whose ancestry comes from outside, alhamdulillah, that's good. We thank Allah for that. But we should be grateful for those that have been here way before us. Those that have laid the foundations, those that faced Mecca 200 years, 300 years before we came here. The first one to raise the adhan, to fast, way before any of us came, were those that came as slaves to this land. And it is true to say that even though those African American slaves, our brothers and sisters, were not able to pass Islam authentically down, still somehow it was embedded in their psyche and subconscious. Somehow these people knew that they're not believers of any other faith tradition, and hence when they discovered a pseudo version of Islam, hundreds and thousands, million people embraced it, because deep down inside their fitrah told them this isn't the true religion. So anything was better than what they were on, and what they were introduced to was a stepping stone that allowed them to then, inshallah, alhamdulillah, now embrace mainstream Islam. And we're very grateful to Allah that in the last 20 years many bridges have been built between between the two communities, still a lot of work needs to be done, and that is very true. Both of our communities have talents that we can benefit from the other community. And one other final point, inshallah ta'ala, and that's not about African American Islam, it's about African Americans, and it's about the civil rights, and it's about the fact that many of us in this room, really and truly, we do not appreciate the struggles. And I'm going to be brutally honest here. Dear brothers, excuse me for being so honest here. I'm going to say something that's a bit awkward for the audience, but it needs to be said. That the fact of the matter is that most of us whose ancestry is from other lands, who have been either come here or, like in my case, even born here, but we are coming ethnically, we're hyphenated Americans, Indian Muslim, Pakistani Muslim. We don't view the struggles of African Americans as being our own. I'm just being brutally honest here, by and large. We don't view civil rights as being connected with our own history. And we're like, okay, that was bad, whatever happened, and that's with those guys, may Allah make it easy upon them. And I want to tell you a personal story to conclude this lecture. And it really it shook me to my core. To this day, every time I think about it, it sends shivers down my spine. How jahil I was, how much of a bubble I myself was in without realizing that, these stories are all interconnected. We're all in this together. And I remember there was a lecture taking place in one of the national conferences. I think it was like the 50th anniversary of the MLK March or something. And so that was the theme of the conference. 10,000 people are going to be there, the large conference that takes place. And I was one of the main speakers on Saturday night. And I was preparing my lecture, and I'm driving to the airport to take the flight. And I thought to myself, subhanAllah, that was 1963 when the speech took place. And 1963, there was still, of course, segregation. And my father, who's sitting in the audience, he came here before in 1962. So I said, you know what, let me call up my father. Let me ask him, this was my question, listen. Let me ask him, maybe he remembers seeing the signs of whites this way, blacks that way. You all know those signs. You've seen those signs. You've seen those signs in the pictures, right? Whites left, rights black. You remember that? The bus, sitting in the back of the bus, the water fountain, white, black. Remember those signs, right? I said, let me call up my dad. Maybe he remembers seeing those signs. Look at how jahil I was. I mean, just thinking back, how stupid. Call him up. It's like, I'm going to the lecture. There's a 50th anniversary of the MLK March. It was 2013. So it's the 50th anniversary. Do you remember seeing those signs? You know what my father said to me? Seeing those signs, I had to obey them. And the minute he said that, wallahi, I felt like a punch to my stomach. Because in my jahalat, in my stupidity, I never ever thought we would be subjugated to that. Like, it never occurred to me that if we had been, as my father, as anybody back there were, that if we had been here back then, that sign applies to me and you just as much as our African brothers who lived through that. And he told me, for the first time, I had never known this because this is all traumatic. He began to tell me stories that happened to him, and he's here, you can ask him yourself, about him as a student, single young man, being treated as if he is an African American. Thrown out of restaurants, refused service at diners, not able to get a haircut. And I had never heard that part. Because once again, let me be brutally honest here, we are being raised in a beautiful bubble of immigrant Islam. We're being raised in an isolated bubble where we have it, mashallah, tabarakallah. We have some wealth, we have some education, and we think, okay, those were struggles of other people and these are our struggles now. And we don't realize, had it not been for African Americans and the civil rights movement, had it not been for MLK, had it not been for the struggles they underwent, we would not be sitting here the way that we're sitting right now. We would not have had the education we have. We would not have had the opportunities we have. How can we be so blind? And I was thinking to myself, how could I not have seen this? It's so self-evident. But that's what happens when you have privilege, you don't recognize it. You know, we blame other communities for the blindness to their own privilege. I'll be honest here. Us here, we also have our privileges. We also have our biases that we don't recognize. We have various things handed to us on a silver platter, and we don't recognize the silver platter that it is. And this is not to make us like, it's just to make us appreciate. That's really what it is. I don't want to make you feel guilty for being who you are. I want you to appreciate the sacrifices of others, the struggles of others. And I keep on saying last point, but this is inshallah the last point. Dear Muslims, any society that you live in, injustice is injustice. Doesn't matter who it's done to. Dhulm is dhulm. And unless and until we take our faith and we channel it to help the oppressed against the tyrant. The Prophet ﷺ didn't have to fight for Bilal. He didn't have to. He could have said, you know what? I have bigger priorities in Mecca. He didn't have to fight for Ammar and Yasir and Sumayya. He didn't have to fight for the lowly. He could have said, maybe tomorrow we'll do that. No, he didn't. Because a part and parcel of Islam is to speak out for the truth, to fight against injustice, to make sure that this type of oppression is not tolerated. The least we can do is be aware and speak out and help out in ways that we can. And all that our brother said before my speech about the double standards, about the imprisonment, about the incarceration, subhanAllah, the dhulm is blatant. Watch the documentary. The double standards are just beyond, it's so obvious. And once again, don't think just because your skin color is brown that you're not going to be affected. Firstly, even if you have a little bit of privileges, you wouldn't be here without the sacrifices of others before you. And secondly, it's our job, if we have a slight privilege because of who we are, with privilege comes responsibility. With privilege comes extra weight, that we now have some clout that we can use and we must use to help others out who are in situations that are unfortunate. But we're all in this together in the end of the day. When Trump wants to be bigoted and racist, he doesn't just attack one group, he attacks all of them. Muslims, immigrants, Mexican, everybody's just lumped together. That's what happens when you have racism and hatred and bigotry. Bottom line, sisters and brothers, especially those whose ethnicity is coming from other places rather than the African American community, thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what our African American brothers have done, and then thank them, because our Prophet ﷺ said, he who does not thank the people does not thank Allah. Appreciate what they've done, learn history, learn the history of Islam in North America, and then get involved in ethnic communities beyond our own. Get involved, see what other people are struggling, and realize every single community can bring something to the table that collectively the Muslim community will be far more powerful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep all of our hearts united. May Allah azza wa jalla save us from arrogance, save us from a superiority complex. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to recognize the privileges that we have and utilize those privileges to the best of manners. And with that, inshallah, jazakumullah khair, and I'll hand it back to our moderator, inshallah ta'ala.
So as we conclude, I just wanted to, we don't really have time for questions and answers, but I know that there's one question that's probably on all of our minds. As Shaykh Yasir was saying, that we have to recognize our privilege and we have to recognize our blessings, and one of the ways that we recognize our blessings is by trying to give back to those, who could really benefit from our help. So to you brothers, I'm pretty sure everyone here is wondering, if I want to help, if I want to somehow contribute anything, my time, my resources, my efforts, what can I do and how can I do it? And if one of you brothers could answer the question and conclude with a dua, inshallah, we'll finish.
Go ahead. Assalamu alaikum. So what we're focusing on right now is trying to get established these youth programs. So we have youth programming that specifically work with our at-risk youth. Of course, when you grow up in communities that are impoverished, you have a lot of needs. We're trying to create opportunities for them to have surrogates, or create a village type of environment where they can have men and women who care about them, who are interested in their growth and their development, who want to support them in any way possible, mentorship, is a big thing. They need financial resources, school supplies, clothes, like anything of that nature. So we have a program that we've set up, the Educating Youth, the education, what is it? The youth?
Educating Youth Empowerment System.
Thank you. The Educating Youth Empowerment System. Brother, you went on a long time. My mind is just, I'm still thinking about all the stuff he said, and I'm like, we need to talk. The Educated Youth Empowerment System, or EYES, it's a program that we put together that essentially we work with at-risk youth, and we provide them with social emotional development, right? So we're building their self-awareness, and we're building their social awareness in the efforts of having them gain this understanding so that they can have purpose or find out what their purpose is. And then once they come about discovering their purpose, we create pathways in which they can attain some kind of business, entrepreneurship opportunities. We're working on a summer program right now with the brothers where we're going to teach them IT skills. We're looking into artificial intelligence, robotics, just different type of gaming, app building, because our community is lacking in those kinds of areas. So any support you have from, coming down and volunteering, mentoring, financial support, of course, is always welcome. We are very grateful for anything that you can provide. Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum. When I opened up earlier, I mentioned and I recited Surah 93, and it's like one of my favorite surahs because not only have I myself fallen into each of those categories as an orphan, meaning where we come from is quite critical, and our children, as well as myself when I was growing up, we didn't quite know where that was. And your culture has so much to do with who you are today. And we are working very hard to reinstill our culture into our people so you can know who you are. So it won't be so easy for you to leave your community. The one thing that you have to your benefit as your people migrated here is you migrated here as a unit, and you were allowed to function in that capacity, whereas we were stolen, brought here, and then fractured. So when I look at that, when I look at that surah, it's very profound in the sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided in each one of those scenarios. And this is what we know will do for the community, because it has done it for myself on an individual basis. And we appreciate you allowing us to come and the opportunity to sit and speak with our brothers and sisters. And inshallah, we'll have much, much time to work with each other going forward. And with that, I'll close.
So Jazakumullah khair. So on behalf, obviously, our brothers made this, they're here, they're our brothers. So on behalf of the board, on behalf of our resident scholar, Shaykh Yasir, our Imam, our Ustad, our complete entire staff, Hafsajat, and about all the community, I'd like to say Jazakumullah khairan for coming, inshallah ta'ala. So we'll have more of these, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.